Hello, I'm Brian Weller, and I want to take you on a journey. And this is a journey into our planetary home, planet Earth. The journey began in 1990, and in the early part of that year, I was approached by one of the biggest petrochemical companies in the world to help them rethink their business. The reason for this was twofold. One, that the company was nearing the end of a cycle of 30 years of its patents. And the second, almost more pressing reason, was because one of its chemical plants in the northeast of England was causing acid rain, and that was destroying the forests of Norway. Coincidentally, the year before, in September 1989, Scientific American published a special edition called Managing Planet Earth. And this was based on 10 scientific studies on the state of the planet at the end of the 1980s. And this formed the basis of what became known as the Brundtland Report. And Brundtland, in fact, Gro Harlem Brundtland, was the Prime Minister of Norway. And she was one of the sponsors of this study. And this became the basis for what became known as Strategies for Sustainable Development. So let's take a look at the journey close up. Okay, so let's take a closer look. What you're looking at here is called a mind map. I was one of the originators with Tony Buzan and a small team back in the 70s that created this new approach to displaying information, really visual thinking. When I was thinking about how best to work with this company, I came up with a radical idea, and that was to create a backdrop of this report on the state of the planet and the human impacts on the planet and how that might inform the company's products and business going forward. Luckily, they agreed. So with a colleague, we then interviewed 12 of their top vice presidents, and together we sat for 5 days in a special retreat, and we discussed this map and then how that could inform the business going forward. So let's take a closer look. What you'll notice here is that, and this is the case with all mind mapping, we always start in the center of the display. Normal note-taking, for example, starts in the top left, usually black and white, left to right. One of the features of mind mapping is we always start in the center because that is the central focus of our attention. Then we have this radial structure, a bit like looking at a tree from above, where the branches and then sub-branches work out from the center. And this actually mirrors the neural architecture of the human brain. It's actually the basis of how we think and then how we learn. So let's look at human population. Back in 1990, humans as a global species was actually approaching, it was about 5.3 billion people. And as we know, that population has been growing. And in those days, human beings were using at least 40% of photosynthetic material per year, consuming the equivalent of 2 tons of coal per person per year. And if you think about the impacts of all of this, which we'll discover, is considerable. Incidentally, 25% of human beings were going hungry every year also. Now, when we look at the whole growth of population, coming to the time we're in now, 2025, although there's been some slowing in the rate of population growth, today it's about 5.5 billion. And we're expected to get up to 10 billion by about 2055, 2060, that kind of time frame. So what we see now is that population growth is having a huge impact on how humans are with the planet and how we consume materials and so on. So this mind map actually is based on 3 important questions, and this is what the scientists were looking at. Firstly, what kind of planet have we got? Secondly, what kind of planet can we get if we adopt more sustainable practices. And thirdly, what kind of planet do we want? And that's more to do with values. So these are the three main branches of this mind map. So as we look at this particular question here, what the scientific studies were looking at were some of the threats to our water, to our climate, and also to biodiversity, and of course to our atmosphere. We've known since the early 70s that the planet was getting warmer. And despite a lot of climate denial, the science is irrefutable on this point that humans are having a greater impact on the world's oceans, on the world's rivers, and also, of course, with our atmosphere. When we look today, for example, at the recent disasters of flooding in Texas, although there is a correlation with some of the cyclones that occurred in New Mexico, the warmer atmosphere, we know, takes water up into the higher parts of the atmosphere, and that then is responsible for rain. And catastrophic rain, of course, is very much a problem for humans. And also, of course, we're seeing more wildfires, and also there is an alarming rate of ocean rising and flooding our coastal zones. So when we look at all of this inventory of what kind of planet we've got, back in 1990, it was a very difficult state of affairs. And what we now know 35 years later, that problem hasn't gone away. In fact, it's increased. Moving now on to what kind of planet we can get. And this is where the emerging science of strategies for more sustainable development came in. And what the scientists looked at were strategies for agriculture, energy use, manufacturing, and also for economics. Interesting word, economics. It comes from the Greek oikos, which means home or house. Nomics is really the study. So in fact, economics is about home study or home management, along with ecology, which is really the study of, again, our planetary home. So with agriculture, for example, we were looking at basically managing the interests between individuals and societies and their impacts on the planet. And it's really a policy challenge. So as we know today, farming is a very, very important part of our overall ecology and economy, but it has to change to make it more sustainable. When we look at energy use, fascinating area. And there we look at some of the emerging technologies that were being thought about back in those days. And one particular one was looking at the emergence of solar, which was still in its infancy during those days. And we can now see that solar energy is emerging as a major source of renewable power. Geothermals, of course, increasingly the case, and many of those plants are in California, as they are in different parts of the world. Interestingly enough, one of the emerging possibilities 35 years ago was known as nuclear fusion. And now we know that one of the biggest nuclear fusion plants is being developed in southern France. And that, of course, nuclear fusion is actually using the energy production of the sun, mirroring or matching the way the sun actually produces energy, rather than nuclear fission, which has a lot of downsides. So many strategies were being looked at with respect to energy and also manufacturing. And one of the issues about manufacturing was that much of our industry is extractive. We're taking the natural resources of the planet, taking what we want, and then we have what's called a waste stream. And this was a problem back then. It's an even greater problem today. Nature does not have the concept of waste. What it does, it recycles everything. So there has been a movement around the planet with human beings to adopt recycling and reusing. And we hope that will continue. But it's a very, very important area. And we have to basically understand that unless we keep house and we clean house and don't just throw our waste materials away, we can have a very, very sad world for our children. I want to add one more thing. and that is there is a gyrus in the Pacific Ocean the size of Texas, which is full of plastics. And we now know, for example, that these plastics are being absorbed by fish, and that's coming into our food stream. Humans also are absorbing microplastics. So this is something we have to get ahead of, and the science was pointing that out in those days. Finally, let's just take a look at what kind of planet do we want. I think this is a particularly important question, because what we do today will be inherited by our children and their children. And despite the fact that there's a growing number of young people who are protesting about the harmful effects of human activity on the planet, much of that has been squashed by all kinds of special interests. That needs to change. And this question is a very key question. So, as I mentioned, what kind of planet do we want is a question about values. We've got to reduce the effects of the threats to our species. We're losing thousands of species literally per month on this planet. Unsustainable. Can we think about human population in terms of its growth rate? A very difficult question. But how much climate change is acceptable? That's a values question. And poverty, how much of that is acceptable? So I mentioned about deep ocean landfills and landfills on the planet. Again, something we have to reverse. What kind of planet do we want? Can we have a new perspective? Can we create that? Can we alter our behavior, our actions, and most importantly, our belief systems? What is our relationship with planet Earth? Is it one that is in partnership with it? Again, in the context of the analogy or the metaphor of it being our home. Surely we want to live in a home that was well cared for. And that again is a question of values. So one of the important conclusions in this report was that altering individual behavior and actions is no longer enough. We have to get a collective shift. That is now essential. And then moving on to this. What does sustainable really mean, and what does development really mean? Paths of progress that meet the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. That really sums up what this important question addresses. So, three key areas: human population, economic growth, and environmental transformation. And those objectives were developed by the World Council on Environment and Development. And that is still in play. The question is, are we really supporting it as a global species? The choice is ours to make and our grandchildren's to live with. Very powerful statement. So moving across here, can we have a shift in our policy on a global level? Very big key question. Technologies, how we manage our environment and our values and objectives. Of course, the one big thing we did not have back in 1990 was the emergence of shared and extensive information technology. We now have social media. We're now moving into the era of artificial intelligence and what that may bring. This has upsides and downsides. The upside is we might begin or be able to model the environment and then give the right kind of knowledge and feedback that will help us really manage the planet more sustainably. So, what is our primary purpose? This is a very deep question. What are we really here for? And this is a question that affects all of us and is particularly being voiced by young people. Can we create a sustainable world where we're in partnership with the natural world, with species, and with our environmental home? And this requires a new kind of vision. And this part of the map really goes into that in some depth. Can we go from open-ended linear systems to more closed-loop circulatory systems? In other words, can we model the way that nature actually works in our human economy? What will motivate people to live in an environmentally sustainable manner. Again, that's a shift of values, and that's a question that we have to continue to think about. And lastly, the visionary beliefs. The scientists came up with 3 requirements. Human species are a part of nature. We live in a finite natural world, and we have to abstain from destroying the natural systems that regenerate it. So that's a very important belief and a very important statement. Economic activity must account for the environmental costs of production. Now, we've seen the rise of carbon capture and carbon costs and carbon trading. To what extent they're successful is still a question. Number 3, the maintenance of a livable global environment depends on the sustainable development of the entire human family. So again, this is something that we all are part of and all responsible for. So we have to start shifting policy and most importantly, spend the money to support those new policies. And lastly, these 3 consistent or 3 values: clear, consistent, sustainable development values, motivations to support them, and institutions to apply those motivations. 3 key requirements. And let's end with this statement here. Back in 1990, if 80% of the human family are poor, we cannot hope to live in a world at peace. That number's been rising. And again, it requires collective action. Thank you.